Okay. All right, we're going to get the evening started. First of all, thank every single one of you for taking the time out on your Friday night to come hang out with us. I know you could be out enjoying the beautiful Floridian-style weather that we have, less the hurricane, unfortunately. But my name is Adam Corman. I want to take a real quick poll. How many people heard about the event via a flyer they saw hanging up somewhere? Let's not do that again. Pretty much through the web, huh? Ear to ear, eye to eye, mouth to mouth, okay. My name's Adam Corman. I am the college or chapter director for Ratio Christi here in the Pittsburgh area. What Ratio Christi is, not that any of you haven't already looked it up, so this is going to be redundant a little bit to your ears. We are a campus apologetics alliance, and basically what that means is that we are trying to answer the call where the topic, such as tonight, on the downward spiral side of that, where Christians are concerned, has lacked, has dropped off, has not, if you will, I don't want to say taken the challenge, but so much been willing to engage in these issues in this manner. And we do that on college campuses. We do that over roughly 200 chapters and growing, both here in the States and international. We are in Pakistan, and we are in South Africa for sure. And like I say, we're growing pretty rapidly in that regards. If you are a student tonight at any university and you're interested in possibly moving something like this forward, pull me aside, talk to me, get my information, whatever way you're comfortable with, and we can figure out how to move forward on that. I have cards so I don't forget. I want to tell you a really quick story about a friend of mine named Pete. I don't see him here, so I will be very respectful to his side by not telling his side. A few years back, Peter and I had known each other for a long time. I grew up skateboarding on the streets of central Pennsylvania, which doesn't sound as tough as it did in my head, but nevertheless, that's what we did. And Peter was the first guy that I ever got drunk with by accident. The drinks just tasted good, and I didn't realize they were alcoholic until it was too late. So we were pretty good friends, and I knew that Peter did not hold the same views that I did about reality and about the world. And a few years ago, I ran into Peter, and we began to have some discussions about things. And what turned the need, in my view, in my opinion, for things like this to happen is how I reacted to Peter. To my disgrace, I was overly confrontational and overly defensive because I didn't have the skills or really even the know-how, let alone the knowledge that I thought was necessary now, I think is necessary now, to have conversations with people who completely disagree with me or may be completely diametrically opposed in how I see things as a Christian. And when I discovered Ratio Christi through a series of events, I realized that although that's not the silver bullet answer to people like me in those situations, or at least people who characters like me in those situations, but it is a big, massive step forward because there's really no silver bullet to many issues that we face. And that's one of the reasons we're here tonight, because I know that within this crowd there are people who don't believe what I believe within the church and without of the church. And I'm so appreciative of you being here because I think it is absolutely vital that if we disagree, the more we should talk. We need to know what each one of us actually believes, which leads me to how we're formatting tonight so that you just kind of get an idea of how things are going to flow. There will be 2 15-minute opening statements, followed by 20 minutes or so of dialogue in which Benjamin, our moderator, will both keep track of time and make sure those guys stay in their seats and they don't get up and start brawling it out. Not going to happen. And then we're going to have roughly 20 minutes or so of Q&A. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I had both of your permissions to say that if people want to hang around after that and chat, completely open to it. Matter of fact, Richard bought a sleeping bag, so he's good for the long haul. Anyways.
So I am planning to sleep, you said. Yeah.
Well, you got a plane ride home, so. And then they'll give their closing statements, a couple minutes, whatever, maybe, maybe not, it's completely up to them. And then I'll come and I'll close the event out. Which brings me to, actually a card I didn't even bring with me, which are the rules, okay? The rules are really simple. I think there's enough respectable people in here that we don't need cheering, clapping, or smirking from either side of either view. We can hold our claps and everything to the end. I only have one small piece of advice. I can't make you do this, can't make you do anything for that matter, but after the event, when it's being discussed, I think it's important hearing both views. Everything is contextualized. And by that I mean, when this YouTube video goes up, and by the way, we're live streaming, so if you're camera shy, most of you are good, you're behind the camera. We will, in a sense, this will eventually get out there, and what happens so many times, from the Christian and from the non-Christian, you see these, and I'm going to be really blunt about this, really stupid remarks on the internet that said, the Christian owned the atheist, boom, 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 or something stupid, or the atheist owned the Christian, boom, boom, or something stupid. That isn't what we're about. That really, my 9-year-old is better than that, I hope. We want this to continue and for this dialogue to continue on after this in the same respectable way that we will see happen tonight by these two and really three individuals. With that, let me introduce whom is speaking tonight. First, we have Dr. Richard Howe. He is both a debater and a speaker. Dr. Howe has taught courses in apologetics and/or philosophy at Southern Evangelical Seminary, Luther Rice Seminary, and Mississippi State University. He's a graduate he's been a graduate teaching assistant also in philosophy at the University of Mississippi, Marquette University, University of Arkansas. Currently, Dr. Howe is a professor emeritus of philosophy, which is a fancy way of saying he's kind of retired. He's also the co-author of, with Dr. Norman Geisler, the book Religion of the Force. He's lectured extensively in philosophy and Christian apologetics, United States, Canada, Europe, and Africa. His Ph.D. dissertation was a defense of the Thomas Aquinas' second way. Richard is married to Rebecca Howe, and in their spare time, Richard and Rebecca enjoy international travel. He received his BA in Bible from Mississippi College, his MA in philosophy from University of Mississippi, his PhD in philosophy from the University of Arkansas. And then we have Dr. Andrew Norman, and there's no way I can read all your different positions, so please Google him, okay? It's the only time you're going to hear me say Google anything tonight. He has held positions, including but not limited to Director of Humanism Initiative at CMU. He has taught physics, and he's been a physics and math teacher at Winchester Thurston. He's a specialty faculty in philosophy at Carnegie Mellon University. He's founder director of Camp Spirit of the Game, which is a character education summer camp for children. And he's obviously teaches philosophy at CMU. But he also has, and I don't have this on here, maybe if you want to throw it out there sometime, you had something to do with disc golf or frisbee that I thought was quite unique, which is interesting. But Dr. Norman teaches philosophy, as I already said, at Carnegie Mellon University. He writes about philosophical foundations of humanism and is a sought-after public speaker. He studies the nature of wisdom, the logic of inquiry, and the evolutionary origins of human reasoning. His work has appeared in Free Inquiry, History and Theory, Humanist Network News, and Philosophical Quarterly. His model of the reason-giving game inspired the widely popular educational computer game Socrates Jones, which is pretty cool, by the way. He has his bachelor's in philosophy from Wesleyan University, his MA in philosophy from Northwestern, and his Ph.D. Where did you get your Ph.D.? Also at Northwestern. That's what I thought. I'm sorry. So, with no more time taken by me, I would like to introduce our speakers, and if you join me in giving them a round of applause for their accomplishment.
No, that's all right.
My dear friend Benjamin Sutphin here. Woo! Sorry about that. This is my first go around at this, so I don't mind telling you that. Benjamin Sutphin.
I learned the alphabet last year.
You're an SES grad, Southern Evangelical grad, but did you just do your bachelor's there?
Just my bachelor's.
Just your bachelor's, but he is heavily inquiring in moving forward with some other possible education as an old man such as myself. So Benjamin is our moderator. I don't know if his wife Stephanie is in the crowd. Oh, where's she at? Oh, there she is. And they have how many children now?
15. No, four.
Four beautiful children, and we're thankful. I'm extremely thankful for his friendship because he was a huge part in not just pushing me, but helping me, equipping me, and moving this whole thing forward to happen. So, first and foremost, I want to thank all these guys because this is a big deal to take their time and come out here and talk to us through talking to each other. So, Mr. Howe will go first, and I'm going to shut up and sit down. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Well, you can Google me. Okay. You're going to Google Dr. Norm, you can Google me, right? You'll get a computer virus when you do, but nevertheless. Now, I'm glad to know this is being live streamed. I guess I wished I had known in advance. I would have showered today for doing that. I'm excited about the Q&A. Now, that's going to be writing. This is a hand signal for writing. We're going to write those down, I think. So be thinking about your questions as both of us are talking. I lobbied for just doing, instead of doing Q&A, just do Q. And then just leave out the A, because you get a whole lot more questions in that way. Going, hey, that is a great question. Okay, yes. Oh, that is a wonderful question. And just, we got 62 questions in 5 minutes. Well, Adam has already given you an insight into what Ratio Christi is about. And broadly, it's about defending the Christian faith. And I want to make sure we're clear, I think I'm fair in saying this for both of us, that it's not just that we're interested in dialogue, though we are interested in that, but I speak for myself as a Christian, that I'm interested in dialogue as a means of trying to advance an agenda. So I don't want there to be any misunderstanding that to me, dialogue is a means to trying to find the truth. It's not the end in itself. And I think that's probably something that maybe a lot of people would agree with. So that's why there is a Ratio Christi. It's advancing an agenda to try to persuade people of a certain worldview, religious belief, or something that Christianity is true. Now, specifically tonight, the topic being faith and reason. By the way, is there a timekeeper? That, like one of the hooks that pulls you off when your time is up? I'm just going to sit here and waste internet time. I'm just going to sit here. In fact, what I was tempted to do, because we stream classes live at the seminary, I have to work this out in advance with one of my... Yes, we have to work this out in advance with the students. But what I'm tempted to do, and I can't do it now because now the audience is going to know, is just right in the middle of a live streaming and go, and so therefore we know that, and just see the people at home going, trying to figure out something's wrong. So, with respect to the issue of faith and reason, my experience as a Christian, and I wasn't raised in the church, but I became a Christian as a teenager. My experience as a Christian was that there is a lot of misunderstanding about what faith is particularly, and then how faith and reason interact, if at all, in general. And a lot of that misunderstanding, in my experience, is within the Christian community, but also in the non-Christian community. Let me give you some examples. What I call a popular misconception. Some of you are probably old enough to remember Miracle on 34th Street, where the characters, Fred Gailey, is falling in love with Doris Walker. And at some intermediate climax in the movie, he's trying to persuade her. He's real sort of happy-go-lucky, touchy-feely, and she's real analytic and businesslike. And he has this line in the movie that gets repeated at least once, where he says, faith is believing in something when common sense tells you not to. And I would submit that's not an unpopular view, at least in my experience, of how people understand faith. It gives rise to these sort of conflicting dichotomies. I mean, reason deals with truth and faith is opinion. And reason deals with facts and maybe faith deals with values. Reason is outer, faith is inner. Reason is public, faith is private. Reason is rational, faith is emotional. Reason is thoughts, faith is feelings. Reason is objective, faith is subjective. Reason is science, faith is religion. Reason is true for all, and faith is true for me. You also find, I think, a misunderstanding of faith promulgated by the new atheists. Sam Harris, for example, says religious faith is the belief in historical and metaphysical propositions without sufficient evidence. He goes on, faith is the mortar that fills the cracks in the evidence and the gaps in the logic. And thus it is faith that keeps the whole terrible edifice of religious certainty still looming dangerously over the world. Richard Dawkins says faith is an evil precisely because it requires no justification and brooks no argument. Other atheists, not necessarily new atheists, Bertrand Russell, as regards the kind of belief, it is thought virtuous to have faith, that is to say, to have a conviction which cannot be shaken by contrary evidence. Or, if contrary evidence might induce doubt, it is held that contrary evidence must be suppressed. Karl Barth, a Christian in neo-orthodoxy, says if one occupies oneself with real theology, one can bypass the so-called natural theology. Natural theology would be the sort of cumulative summation of theological decisions based on reason. One can bypass so-called natural theology only as one would pass by an abyss into which it is inadvisable to step if one does not want to fall in. All one can do is to turn one's back upon it as upon the great temptation and source of error by having nothing to do with it. Contemporary evangelical Christian circles like presuppositionalists, if you're familiar with that term, it's a sort of a methodology of how you defend the Christian faith. The fountainhead of American presuppositionalism, Cornelius Van Til, said this: reason and fact cannot be brought into fruitful union with one another except upon the presupposition of the existence of God and His control over the universe. Jason Lyle says, ultimately, biblical creationists accept the recorded history of the Bible as their starting point. Faith is a prerequisite for reason, he goes on. In order to reason about anything, we must have faith that there are laws of logic which correctly prescribe the correct chain of reasoning. In fact, I just today, in talking with a young man, had this idea. Well, we all kind of start out. We all have faith at some point. If you're a Christian here, I would hope to try to disabuse you of that, to think, well, even Professor Norman has faith because he has faith in his senses to tell him about reality and has faith in the laws of logic. I would submit to you that is not at all what faith is. And I don't even think that's what faith is in his estimation. And even postmodern Christianity that sees that, well, everything is interpreted. So we all kind of have our way of interpreting the quote-unquote facts. In contradistinction to these and perhaps other examples of what I think are mischaracterizations of faith in particular, but by implication how faith and reason might compare and contrast, I want to advance what some might refer to as a classical view of faith and reason. Now, as the word classical might suggest, it's a view of faith and reason that finds its roots in the antiquity of the Christian church, that is, from the church fathers. But I'm not suggesting that because it has a long and venerable tradition within Christianity, that that's what makes it true. But at the very least, especially if you're a Christian here tonight, the fact that it does have such a venerable history, at least ought to commend it to be considered. What have Christians thought, at least a contingency of Christian thought since the church fathers, about what faith is and how faith and reason intersect? So let me give you a preliminary definition, and then I want to qualify it here in due course. Reason is believing something on the basis of demonstration. Whatever demonstration looks like. A demonstration would vary according to the kind of thing that's being demonstrated, whether it's a claim of history, a claim of biology, a claim of mathematics, a claim of physics, or whatever. The demonstrations may vary, but whatever constitutes a demonstration within a certain discipline, according to the protocols and tools and methods appropriate for that discipline, that's a demonstration. If you believe something because you understand and seen the demonstration, then that is said classically to be by reason. In contradistinction, faith would be believing something on the basis of authority. So, for example, if you're familiar with Fermat's last theorem, Pierre de Fermat was a 17th century mathematician, and all of his theorems have been proven to be either true or false, except for one. And that became known as Fermat's last theorem. And it had been the longest enduring enigma in mathematics until 1993, actually 94, when Andrew Wiles of Princeton University proved that Fermat's last theorem is true. Now, the proof is around 100 pages in the Annals of Mathematics, published in 1995. Now, I can't understand the proof. In fact, John Lennox, a mathematician from Oxford University, told me there are very few mathematicians in the world that can track with what Andrew Wiles did in proving the truth of Fermat's last theorem. But I believe that Fermat's last theorem is true. Why? Because I trust what Andrew Wiles said. Now, can I understand the demonstration? No. But am I foolish to trust him when he says it's true? No. Why? Because reason has shown me that Andrew Wiles is a reliable source with respect to mathematics. And because he's a mathematician, I trust him that he's right. And so that, in principle, I think, is what classically the Christians have tried to say about what is faith. But of course, we're not just merely interested in the enigmas of mathematics when we talk about this faith and reason. We're really interested in issues related to religion and God. So let me qualify the definition for the purposes of how we understand faith and reason in this classical sense. Reason, believing something on the basis of demonstration. Faith is believing something on the basis of divine authority, specifically. Now, John Locke, who held and believed that God had revealed himself to the human race, nevertheless gives this caveat. He says, only we must be sure that it be divine revelation and that we understand it right. And he goes on to say, because it might not even be from God, even if there is a God, or you might not have understood it, on and on and on. The key here to not miss is the instrument by which a person tries to come to some settled conclusion about whether there's a God, and if so, whether He's revealed Himself, and if so, whether this is His revelation, those are done by reason. And reason tries to do the best it can with the evidence at hand. Having made its decision, then a person decides whether they're going to trust what they, rightly or wrongly, think God has revealed. Now, is that a recipe for potential disaster? Absolutely. Well, God told me to, punch your lights out or something. Yeah, like that. Of course, there's that danger. But the principle, I think, is not spurious. The principle, I think, is legitimate. Just as it's legitimate to trust Andrew Wiles, if I have reason to think he's a mathematician, then it makes sense in principle to trust at least what I think is God speaking to me by whatever instrument I've come to believe. And so as the Christian that I am and the way I combat it, I would try to encourage Christians, know why you think there is a God. Deal with the arguments for and against the existence of God, and make sure if you think there is a God, you think it because you think it's true by demonstration, primarily philosophical demonstration. And then, more than that, if you think the Bible, for example, is the revelation of God, make sure you know why you think it's the Bible as opposed to the Quran or as opposed to the Book of Mormon, whatever. And then having decided, make sure when you read it, you do it with a certain modicum of conscientiousness with respect to principles of sound hermeneutics. It's not a lot to ask, but sometimes you might wonder. Augustine said, "For who cannot see that thinking, that is reason, is prior to believing, that is faith? For no one believes anything unless he has first thought it is to be believed." Thomas Aquinas said, "One who believes, that is, has faith, gives assent to things that are proposed to him by another person and which he himself does not see." In other words, they're trusting this other person in some area. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says, "The existence of God the Creator can be known with certainty through His works by the light of human reason, even if this knowledge is often obscured and disfigured by error." John Calvin, to kind of skip across the spectrum here, says, "Therefore, in reading the profane authors, that is, the non-Christian, the admirable light of truth displayed in them should remind us that the human mind, however much fallen and perverted from its original integrity, is still adorned and invested with admirable gifts from its Creator." So, what would that look like practically speaking? Let me just finish with this illustration. Take an event like the death of Jesus on the cross. I don't know of any bona fide historian, Christian or non-Christian, that doubts the event of the crucifixion. Now, there may be some that I don't know about, perhaps, but at least in Anglo-American scholarship, I haven't seen any historian that calls into question the event of the death of Jesus. Now, how would one approach that question? Well, whatever this looks like, because I'm not a historian, whatever this looks like, it's going to be according to the tools and methods and protocols appropriate for historical inquiry. This is how we know he died, because of the history, eyewitness testimony, archaeological evidence, whatever we're going to do. So that is something that a person could believe on the basis of reason, meaning they've seen the historical arguments, they make the decision, but they're persuaded by the demonstration, they conclude that Jesus died on the cross. But the fact that, if this indeed is a fact, which I believe it is, but it's in dispute, that Jesus' death on the cross pays for my sins and gives me reconciliation with my Creator such that I can flourish as a human in happiness unending for eternity, that's what Jesus' death did for me. I had to be told that, I think, by God through the Bible. So that would be an example of something that I accept by faith. Now, I could be wrong in concluding that God told me that, because I could be wrong that there's a God, perhaps. Those are all possible mistakes I might have made. But the principle, I think, is intact. That I've come to believe that there is this God, that He has revealed Himself through this book, and that Jesus is who He said He was, and He did what He said He did. And so, since I can't demonstrate that by any means that I can imagine, as far as the way I could demonstrate something historical or mathematical, I accept that by faith. And in fact, I would submit to you that exactly is the gospel message of Christianity. That if a person trusts in what God did for them through the death of Jesus Christ and His resurrection, then they will have eternal life. Thank you. Okay. All right. I was doing that for this reason. Thank you.
Nicely done. Let's see. Can you guys hear me okay? So, Adam neglected to mention that I'm also an ordained minister in the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. But it's okay, Adam, she forgives you. So we're here to resolve a question that's bedeviled humanity for, about 5,000 years, I believe. I'm going to give myself a reminder not to go over. But don't worry, we have the better part of an hour, so I think we're good, right? Right, we're going to get this resolved, guys? Richard?
You want to? We can arm wrestle? No, I know I'll do that.
All right. So by prior agreement, I've agreed to speak initially about by filling in the blank in the statement, why I am a blank. So I'm going to fill in the blank the way I want to, and before the hour's out, you may want to put in something else in that blank, but hear me out. So I consider myself a secular humanist, and more specifically, an out-of-the-closet secular humanist. And I think that being a secular humanist is a very fine thing, and I'll try to explain why, and invite you to join me as a secular humanist if you think it makes sense. So a humanist is someone, it's been defined different ways, but I'll define it for tonight's purposes as somebody who tries hard to understand what is and what's right, who welcomes opportunities to update and revise their understanding of what is and what's right, and who tries their best to do what's right based on their evolving understanding of what's right. Now, you'll notice that this is a very inclusive definition. That's by design. I'll warrant that many of you are probably humanists in that sense too, and so I'll say welcome aboard. We have that in common. Now we have a common ground. Maybe we can build on it. A secular humanist is a humanist who lacks belief in God. So I'm a secular humanist because I don't believe that God exists, and when I say that, what I'm giving you primarily is just an accurate report of what I find when I look within myself for belief in God. I didn't start this life knowing in advance that I wanted to disbelieve in God. In fact, there have been times in this life when I've very much wanted to believe in God's existence, but that belief has never come upon me, and through no fault of my own, I'm a non-believer. And I'm not willing to fake it. I think honesty compels me to say that that belief is not within me, and I think most secular humanists discover that they're secular humanists by simply looking within themselves and asking themselves, in all honesty, do I really honestly believe that God exists? And when people do that, they often find that the genuine belief, as opposed to something quite a bit shakier, really isn't there. And they conclude, gee, I guess I'm a secular humanist after all. Second reason I'm a secular humanist is that I've studied the evidence and I've come to understand that religion just isn't very good for humanity. Let me say a little bit about the evidence I've come across. A man named Scott Galen did a study in 2012 where he surveyed dozens and dozens of other studies that looked for a link between religiosity and what scientists call pro-social behavior, which is to say niceness, basically. And Galen concluded that there is no link whatever, no statistical link at all, between belief in God and goodness. Robert Putnam wrote a magisterial work of religion in America, and after putting about 800 or 900 pages into it, he ended up concluding that, quote, religious beliefs turn out to be utterly irrelevant to explaining good behavior. Now, it turns out that belonging to a congregation can make you a better person, but belonging to a bowling league can do that also. The important thing is to get involved with other people and to belong to some sort of community. That does have a statistically significant effect on people's behavior, but religious belief has none. The United Nations published a report in 2005, and among the really interesting findings, so they had a measure of what's called human welfare, which is sort of a complex aggregate of crime rates and longevity rates and teenage pregnancy and many, many different measures of social function and dysfunction. And what they found is that the healthiest and best functioning nations on earth are extremely irreligious. They have very low levels of religiosity. Meanwhile, the 50 nations in this world that are most dysfunctional are almost all of them highly religious. Think about that. It's enough to shake your faith that being religious is a force for good. Gregory Paul published a study in 2005 where he plotted the religiosity, the average religiosity of every country in the nation against how well-functioning that society is, using a measure similar to the one the United Nations used. And he found that there's a distinct correlation between religiosity and social dysfunction. Now, I'm not sure which is the cause and which is the effect, and I'm not making any claim about which is the cause and which is the effect, but it should shake your conviction that religion is necessarily a force for good. Joseph Baker, a sociologist at University of Tennessee, did a similar study of the 50 American states, and he found the same correlation that Gregory Paul had found. The most religious states in America are the least well-functioning. The least religious states in America are the best functioning. And there's a good deal more evidence out there, but I'll end that reason on that note. Finally, I think common sense tells me that religious faith is not a good thing. How can faith be a good thing? How can it be a good thing to rely on a method of belief fixation that is demonstrably unreliable? Now, even if you think faith led you to the truth, the fact is there are people with hundreds of other different faiths that led them to false belief. So as a whole, the batting average of faith as a method of determining your belief is woefully bad. Why would you rely on something that is, objectively speaking, that unreliable? Why would you pretend to know things, like Jesus will reward you with eternal life, that you can't possibly know? Surely none of us is in a position to really know that, in the perfectly ordinary, everyday sense of really know that we're familiar with from science and common sense. How can it be a good thing to excuse wishful thinking by rebranding it as faith? And if you're allowed to indulge in your articles of faith, then why isn't the white supremacist allowed to indulge in his articles of faith? I'm not aware of a single faith tradition that has given us a principled way to distinguish why their faith is right and other faiths are wrong. It's this big blind spot in the epistemology of religious belief. How can it be a good thing to systematically defy basic norms of evidence? We expect our doctors to make their decisions based on evidence. We expect the people who build our bridges to use evidence when they design and build bridges. The one area of our lives where we systematically ignore and even flaunt evidential norms is religion. And the concept of faith functions day in and day out to excuse such transgressions of evidential norms. How can it be a good thing to frighten children with stories of hell? How can it be a good thing to celebrate blind obedience the way all of the Abrahamic faiths do, by making the story of Abraham and Isaac just central to their canons? And this is a story about a man who was ready to slaughter his own son because his faith for God was so profound and so blind. And he's held up as an example of what we should be like. Is that a good idea to do that? I don't think so. How is it a good idea? How is it a good thing to worship a being who said, and I quote, and I'm reading now from Samuel 15:3, "Now go and destroy the Amalekite nation. Men, women, children, infants, cattle, destroy them utterly." This is God himself speaking, according to Holy Scripture. Or a scripture that many well-meaning Christians hold up as sacred. Is it really a good idea to promote the idea that a book with teachings like that is sacred? I don't think so. Is it really a good idea or a good thing to align yourself with a religion that teaches, and again I quote, this is from Deuteronomy 13:6, "If your brother, your son, or your daughter the wife who you love or your closest friend entices you, saying, "Let us go worship other gods," or no God at all. I inserted that last bit. Do not listen to them. Show them no pity. You must put them to death. Your hand must be the first in putting them to death. Stone them to death because they tried to turn you away from your God. This is gospel, folks. And it's telling you to go out and kill non-believers like me. How is that a good thing? I don't know if you know the Bible as well as your average atheist does. A recent study compared the knowledge of the Bible among different religious groups. Turns out atheists knew more about the Bible than Christians did. Read the Bible, folks. It's an excellent way of finding out what your professions of faith really commit you to. And I submit they don't commit you to many of the good beliefs that I know you have. So my plea today is to be honest with yourself and ask yourself, honestly, is it really a good thing to be religious? I know it might feel good. I know it might make you feel special. It might make you feel like you'll live for all eternity. But do you really believe it? Honestly? And on what basis? Because the tradition says so? Because an ancient book says so? Because a voice in your head says so? None of those are reliable methods. So I invite you to build on the humanism that is already part of who you are. I can tell you this, it's deeply satisfying. According to the research, it's a better way to serve humanity. And finally, by bending with better reasons each and every time they come along, you won't have to break with the crisis of faith under the cumulative weight of denial. Thank you.
Bottom? That's on. I got it. Thanks. Whoa. I think the people who made this church, like, I don't know how long ago, just didn't consider microphones, which is why it keeps bouncing all over the place. That was a joke. That was very convincing. Very convincing. I must say that I think one of the things that was left out, I thought, and it's not, well, many things could be said, I should say. Many things could not be said. When you were talking, it kind of reminded me of Puddleglum in The Silver Chair, C.S. Lewis's famous Chronicles of Narnia, who, as many of you may know, was an atheist. And when you're talking, it was like, wow, man, you're really convincing. Like, to not hold my cards back. I am a Christian, but I kind of felt like I was in the cave, with Prince Aurelian, and then all of a sudden I was like, wow, Puddleglum's gonna show up and like put his foot on the fire, and I thought you were trying to convince me that the sun doesn't exist, Anyway, that was supposed to be a joke too. So I just had some questions for both of you, and I just have a couple pages, and hopefully we can get through them. Just to kind of cap on what is, I think, a little bit of his heart and Richard's and Adam's, who thinks our world is nuts? Can I get a hand? Who thinks our world, be really honest, who thinks our world is crazy? You see the TV, okay, that's pretty awesome. I think, not that the world's nuts, but that everybody pretty much agrees that the world's nuts. I think it's nuts too. One of the reasons why we wanted to do this in Pittsburgh, in the heart of the city, is because I just met Dr. Norman this evening, and as a Christian, I believe that Andy is made in the image of God, and he is an atheist. Richard is a Christian. I have friends that vary from different. Some are Catholic, some are agnostic. On and on it goes. Like, there are so many different ideas, and America is an idea. It's not a creed. It's not a one group of people over another. I mean, you can argue that, I know, all day long. But one of the things that I wanted to do this evening was just bring a bunch of people together and talk about things that really matter, things that grip everybody's heart. I lost my dad a couple of years ago, and I long to see him again. And I ask myself the question sometimes, like, is that longing real? Will I really see him again? Is it just a joke? Where do I get these longings from? You know, where do you get the longing for love? Like, is that just fake? You know, is it real? Anyway, I just wanted to have an evening where we could set aside and as fellow Americans and just talk about things that really matter, things that maybe those things don't matter to you, but maybe things not mattering to you matters to you. That's legit, you know? Some things don't matter to you.
May I pick up on that?
Yeah.
I think I'm good. Can you hear me?
Got a microphone.
Yeah, I'm really pleased, Ben, to hear you mention. I think it's very important that we talk about things that matter. And as Adam mentioned at the beginning, we're kind of out, as a nation, we're sort of out of practice about that. We don't often take the time to really listen respectfully to people with different religious points of view, people with different political points of view. And it's really showing up in America more and more as forms of partisanship and ideological thinking that's, I think, very disturbing to me. So I love the idea of and the reality of things like this, and I'm really grateful that you guys put this together. There's a really interesting theory now about where the religious impulse comes from, and I'd love to share it with you. It's just very short. The idea is this: human beings need to feel that they matter. The universe doesn't always tailor to that need, so we often suffer crises of worrying that we might not matter. And what's really powerful about so many of the world's religions, and I think Christianity, this is especially true of Christianity, is it puts together a package of beliefs that does a really, really good job of making you feel like you matter. And I struggle with expressing my doubts about religion because I know how psychologically and emotionally important those beliefs can be to people. And so I'm very sympathetic to people who need religion in their lives, and I, like every religious person I know, needs to feel as though I matter. I find different ways of satisfying that need, but I respect that need and I recognize it as a valid need. And I think humanism, another way to define it, is that it's an attempt to understand what really matters and to really be honest with ourselves about what really matters. And I think as long as religious people and irreligious people can both agree that we should try to work out together what really matters and then serve that, we have a common ground we can build on, and we can dialogue in good faith.
So now that we kind of established that, Richard, I want to start with you. I'm trying to be fair-minded, if I can be.
I'm going to try that.
One of the questions I have is the number one objection to the faith I would say in particular Christian faith in God, is because of all the evil and suffering in this world. Do you believe that this is a problem for us, that is belief, or God? In other words, do you believe that it's a problem for Him to solve, or do you believe it's a problem that we can solve and maybe not be able to solve on our own? And on a personal level, I think pain is very real and deep for everyone who has ever lived. Is it random, as Richard Dawkins would say, or if Christ is truly God, personal, as the Bible says, full of love, can He, in all our shame, our pain, our hurt, brokenness, heal us, heal our hearts as humans in some real way in this life? How would you respond to that?
Yes. That's how I was. Well, as a sort of segue into that, let me hitchhike on Andy's earlier comments about needing to feel like we matter and these kind of things. And by the way, he has a very interesting talk on YouTube that he just reminded me tonight. I don't think he's ever seen his own talk, but on this very subject. So I would commend that to your viewing if you search on YouTube for it. I generally don't like thought experiments. As a philosopher, that's sort of odd because we traffic in these things. I think sometimes they create more problems than they solve. But there's one particular thought experiment that's common and popular among philosophers that I was reminded of, and it's the idea of what if there was a such thing as an experience machine that you could step into, be plugged into. We might think of the Matrix perhaps now. This was before the movie came out. And that machine would be able to induce to you this sort of unending sense of happiness, however that goes on to be defined. Would you be willing to more or less get in the machine and experience this life of happiness? When you're deciding to get in the machine, you already know that it's not going to be real. And surprisingly, I think a lot of philosophers discovered, as they posed this question, that a lot of people would opt not to. That there was something about the experience of happiness being tethered to something real that mattered to people. And so I can't help but think that while I want to feel like I matter, I guess, I suppose I do. I haven't done that much introspection, but let's just say for the sake of argument. But I would think I do. I'm certain, or at least I'm confident that I would say, however, in light of wanting to matter, that whatever makes me feel like I matter, that is connected to what's true. So as self-serving as it is as a Christian philosopher, I keep always wanting to turn the argument back on, yes, but what's actually true? What are the arguments for what's true? Now, Andy has looked at the arguments and he's not convinced that there's a God, or maybe he's convinced that there's not a God. I've looked at the arguments, I'm convinced that there is a God. That serves as my speculative treatment of every other question. That serves as part of how I digest how I'm going to say, well, what about when God told Abraham to do this? And what about the Amalekites? And what about the Holocaust and these kind of things? I can't disabuse myself of still trying to interpret my answer to those questions in light of what I think is actually true. If it forces me to have to reverse engineer, even to the extent that it might look in some people's minds as, well, you're really going out on a limb and stretching it to make that reconcile. I go, I can't do anything else if I want to be consistent and I want to be rational. I have to reconcile my experience of evil in the world with what I think on independent grounds that there is this God who has all of these superlative attributes that classical theism has attributed to it. Now, that may be satisfactory for some people. All I can do in response is every time say, well, here's the arguments as I've heard. I will say this. This is, again, just my experience as a philosopher, and more specifically as a Christian philosopher. As I've been reading, because both my master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation were on the question of God's existence. And in all my research, overwhelmingly what I have encountered, particularly with contemporary atheism, is just a breathtaking lack of acquaintance with the classical arguments for God's existence. Now, that's not necessarily the atheist's fault. If you see what kind of arguments they probably do encounter in contemporary Christianity that has all of these spurious views of faith, well, you got to presuppose God, or you got to get away from the abyss of natural theology, whatever. If that's what a lot of these atheists are encountering, then I suppose I can't blame them for having what I think is totally missing what really are the most salient and relevant arguments. So I always answer these questions in light of that conviction that I think there is a God who is eternal, who is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, simple, impassible, immutable, all-loving, all-wise, all of the superlative attributes that we acquaint with classical Christianity. That serves as a conviction that I've come to as a philosopher and as a Christian, against which then I try to deal with specific things. And I've discovered that a lot of times the way I deal with these things, it may ring hollow to someone who's an atheist. And I go, I don't know what else to say.
Follow up? Sure. With that? So Richard, just a question of clarification. Earlier you spoke about your approach to dialogue as a Christian, and I believe you said that you think of dialogue as a means to the end of truth.
Yes.
I want to ask.
Can be, at least.
Yeah, and I want to ask now about your how you approached the arguments for and against God's existence. They seem like good arguments to you.
Yes.
When you set out to examine them for the first time, was your mind already made up?
Yes, for the most part, yeah, because I was already a theist when I read the arguments.
So my conception of dialogue is one where you never make up your mind to the point where you're not open to persuasion.
Oh, yeah, you didn't ask me if I was open to persuasion. You asked me if my mind was made up. Maybe I misunderstood what that means. What I mean by my mind was made up is I already knew what I thought was true. But knowing what I think is true doesn't preempt the fact that there could be contrary evidence that could cause me to go, well, I'm not so sure anymore. Good. I mean, that's actually happened to me as a philosopher. It's happened to me as a Christian. In fact, when I was saved, as Christians use the term, as a 16-year-old, having not been raised in the church, didn't have any religious background, became a Christian at 16, I lost my faith in college because I began to be persuaded that some of the things that I had come to believe probably wasn't true, or at least I was doubting. Well, and then as I kept reading, then I reaffirmed later sort of what I had affirmed before, but began to know more and more why I thought it was true, whereas before I might have just believed it and not know why as much.
It's good to hear, Richard, that you approach dialogue and inquiry willing to be persuaded, because I think many Christian apologists actually adopt something like the following stance. I do apologetics so that I can sway you, but I'm not going to allow your arguments to sway me. Now, this particular attitude was on full display in the famous debate between Bill Nye and Ken Ham. Oh. There was a question in the Q&A at the end where the moderator asked, what, if anything, would change your mind? Now, Bill Nye responded simply and directly, evidence. Give me good evidence why I should reject the theory of evolution. Give me good evidence why quantum theory isn't in fact true, and I will revise my view. And then Ken Ham was asked, and he said, nothing. Nothing will change my mind. I'm a Christian, and that's it. Now, I know that we have an example of a Christian right here who doesn't take that same attitude, and I applaud him for that. But I do think that many people approach debates over faith and religion with their minds made up to the point where, despite their best efforts, they can't even hear arguments on the other side. In fact, it's true of ideological positions generally, that when you become swept up in an ideology, it becomes very hard to hear any challenge to that ideology. Now, I would classify Christianity and most other religions as ideological. I hope that's a fair characterization. If it's not, I hope to learn from it.
No, I think that's fair if I understand the term right. And you say something very interesting here. I want to go on the record as saying this. First of all, I do think that this character flaw of not being willing to be swayed is just a human foible, and I think we could probably find examples of that in religion and in politics and all kinds of things. You might find it interesting to know I'm actually debating, or dialogue, if you will, Ken Ham next month, and I just repudiate Ken Ham's approach. And what grieves me even more, there were countless substantive debates between Christians and non-Christians that have been going on for years that, to my knowledge, almost never got on the radar screen of most churches I'm familiar with. And then Ken Ham comes along. I won't speak against Bill Nye. I'll just throw stones at my own team. And all of a sudden, everybody just gets giddy over this debate. And they're streaming it live in their churches. And I'm going, there were so many substantive debates. I was at some of them live watching. I wasn't the debater, but I'm watching it. And I go, where was the church streaming that debate? That would have been a debate where you had two people who cared about what was true and would love nothing better than the other guy try to convince me otherwise. Because they loved, it's not that they weren't willing to be swayed, it's that they were so enthusiastic about what they thought was true, they relished the opportunity to test what they were convinced of just to see if it survived the test, which I think you would celebrate. And I'm telling you, if you like that kind of attitude, for every Ken Ham there might be out there, professional apologists, there are scores that aren't that way. Now, I'm not impugning Ken's character or his motives or his Christianity. I'm just saying as an apologist, this is what we're debating, in fact. We're in a debate. It's called man's word or God's word. Where should apologetics begin? Because he will say, well, it's man's word or God's word. And I said, that's just false dilemma. Well, at any rate, I don't want to have the debate here, but I invite you to that. It's going to be streamed. You can get information back if I do a commercial back there on the table for that debate. But I celebrate this attitude. I hope I try to be as honest as I know how to be. I'm not immune to the foibles that we all are, perhaps, but I enjoy reading atheist philosophy. Dale Mackey, Michael Martin, George Smith, others. So
to keep
I love that.
To keep with this theme, since it's growing, Socrates was before Christ. Socrates. I thought you said that.
I know who Socrates is.
I think some people. Socrates was actually a stonemason, and there's in the book of Acts when Paul is going up to Mars Hill, and there's all these philosophers debating, and Apostle Paul goes up to debate with them, and on the stone, this thing, it says, to an unknown God. A lot of people think that Socrates actually was the one who made that very thing, which is interesting because I think had Socrates been around during the time of Christ, I think he would have believed in Christ, because I think Socrates was after truth. And I think if you go where truth leads, then it really touches every area of life, not just what we believe about religion. But so to that end, I think C.S. Lewis was at one time an atheist, and who became convinced that actually he became convinced of theism, and it was actually J.R.R. Tolkien who led him back to the Christian faith. Lewis said famously that he came kicking and screaming back into the church and darting this way and that, and eventually he bent his knee and confessed that Christ was Lord. But before that happened, one of the things that, and this is for both of you, which is why I'm bringing it up, Socrates, because he was after truth. I think Lewis was honest. He was after truth. Lewis lived through the First World War and the Second World War. He was in the Second World War. He was a warden. He would walk around the city of Oxford warning people to go inside because the Nazis were bombing London. And during the First World War, one of his friends was, as Lewis didn't really talk about the war, but much, but there's one part in, I think, his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, where he says that one of his dear friends, a grenade exploded his friend's face off, and shrapnel went into Lewis, and that's what gave Lewis trench fever, which got him out of the war, which eventually led him to ask the question, which was on the minds of most people during the First World War, which is, when everything was the age of progress and technology and the world's getting better and food supply and blah, 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 Lewis says there can't possibly be a God because the world is so hideous. So C.S. Lewis, before converting to Christianity from atheism, believed that the world was grim and hopeless. He was outraged at the evil and suffering he saw in the world, and rightly asked, and this is for both of you to answer, he rightly asked, where did he get the idea that somehow there was a standard, a rule of measurement that he was judging the injustice by? Where did he get this idea that the world was out of whack? What I think Lewis is getting at is that morality is absolute and inescapable. Do either of you think Lewis is onto something? Lewis, again, if we ask, he says, why ought I to be unselfish? And you reply, because it is good for society. We may then ask, well, why should I care what's good for society except when it happens to pay me personally? And then you will have to say, because you ought to be unselfish, which simply brings us back to where we started. How do you either of you answer in relation to atheism or theism? What is it about morality, evil, the mess that the world's in? How do you shore up your convictions that either if you're an atheist, and I don't actually know your position, so I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if evil is an illusion, or materialism is all there is, or Richard, from the Christian perspective, will God do something with evil? Will there ultimately be justice? Go for it.
Yeah, I'm happy for you to go.
Yeah, you may be surprised to hear that I'm not a fan of moral relativism. Many people assume, I think, that if you don't have belief in God, then you can't hold that moral values can be objective. But I think that to simply say, oh, values are all relative, you like murder, you don't like murder, but I do, so, everybody can it's all relative to what you want. No, I don't think that's a healthy attitude to take. I don't think it's true. I think many of the most important moral rules have an objective basis. And I think that objective basis has to do with whether the behaviors enjoined by the rule tend to promote collective flourishing. So behavioral rules that tend to promote our collective welfare, we tend to call those good or moral, and behaviors that tend to diminish human welfare, we tend to call bad. And notice that you can understand morality as objective in that sense, because there really is a fact of the matter as to whether murdering somebody promotes human welfare. And in fact, the answer is no, it really, really objectively doesn't. Notice that you can say that about moral rules even though the rules stem entirely from the structure of nature itself. There's no need for a supernatural being because there are objective facts about what works to promote human flourishing, and that, I think, is the real basis of morality.
Okay, so this is the part where I get in trouble with probably most of the Christians listening to me because my view is closer to Andy's than a lot of Christians' views are. And I regret the fact that a lot of contemporary Christians have abandoned what I think has been a guiding principle of morality in Western civilization, certainly for the creation of our nation, which is natural law theory. Now, I think the question of good has to be addressed before we even can have a meaningful question about moral good. And by the way, you might be surprised to learn that most philosophers, at least most of the ones I'm familiar with, they reject moral relativism. A lot of people think, well, it's usually the philosophers in the college campuses that regret how relativistic their students are. Because most philosophers are not moral relativists. For whatever reason, they're not. Anyway, just a little plug there for philosophers. We're not all bad, right?
It's a literature department.
So, yeah, I think, without rehearsing natural law theory, except just to say this little bit, that we have to try to decide, well, what does it mean for something to be good first before we can even talk about something morally good? We use the word good all the time. That was a good pizza. Hey, that's a good tie. You know, you really smell good. All these kind of things. Well, what do we mean? I would submit that basically what we mean is that when we say X is good, we mean that X exemplifies or actualizes all of the properties that it ought to have by virtue of being X. So a good knife has a sharp blade. A spoon wouldn't be a good spoon with a sharp edge, would it? But that's a good knife. Why? Why isn't sharp good for a spoon? Because that's not what it is to be a spoon. But it is what it is to be a knife, is to have a sharp blade. It would make no sense for somebody to go, well, who are you to say that a knife ought to have a sharp blade? You know, unless you've got God out there that tells you that knives ought to be sharp, then we're all lost in it. And that's the way I think a lot of Christians mistakenly think about morality. Unless God's there to tell you what it is, how are you going to know? Go, I just know what a knife is. I just know that a knife ought to have a sharp blade. But let me just bring this to, so don't forget your question, because I want to. So then the question is, all right, so I think a good human being is a human who is what a human ought to be by virtue of being a human. Now, we just didn't start asking the question, well, what is it to be a good human? We just didn't start asking that question. We've been having this discussion, at least in Western civilization, for 2,300 years. Aristotle's got several treatises on what is the good life. And as a world religions professor, you'll find a startling amount of unanimity among world religions and world philosophies about what a good human being is. Don't murder, respect other people, be faithful with your promises, don't steal things, on and on and on. You just see a lot of this unanimity. So let me finish with this. Then the question becomes then, what is morality? Without argument, I would just insert, and then we can talk about it later if we want, that morality, which is unique to humans, I would believe, I agree with Aristotle, is because we have rationality and we have free will, whatever those are, all right? So let me finish with this illustration. During the Nuremberg trials, the justices of the Nuremberg trials were from the Soviet Union, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. But they couldn't try the defendants in the trials on the basis of the laws of the Soviet Union, France, the United Kingdom, and United States, because those defendants weren't from those nations. But they also couldn't try them on the basis of German law, because they didn't break any German laws. Hitler made sure the Constitution and the laws were tooled for the final solution to the Jewish question. So what did they try them on the basis of? They used a phrase that we still use today as committing crimes against humanity. Now I ask my students, okay, so what is a humanity? What is a humanity? Is it real in any sense of the term real? If you say no, how could you possibly commit a crime against it? If you say yes, it's real in some sense, I would submit to you, you're either going to be some version of Platonism, Plato's philosophy, or some version of Aristotle's philosophy, if you think that humanity is a real thing. So I would argue that that's where morality begins, that's where its objectivity comes from, is the objectivity of what it is to be human. And I think there's a sense in which that probably doesn't depart too far from what you're trying to argue. Where the Christian part comes in, it's not so much what we need to introduce God into the equation so somehow I can be objective with the morality. No, talking about objective morality is like talking about objective gravity to me. It just is what it is because humans are what they are. But I would submit, without argument, because we don't have time, and that's a different subject, that as soon as you grant some kind of reality to the nature, to something that makes us human, that's a metaphysical doctrine that is part of what will eventually become the classical cosmological argument for the existence of God. So I think that if a person's going to say, well, I don't agree with the cosmological argument, well, where are you going to depart from it? They're going to then sort of work backwards to negate something in the argument. They're going to undo the very things that give rise to the very morality that we already knew was the case. So the argument is, whatever it is that has to be true metaphysically about humans, like natures and other things, rationality, free, whatever's true that makes morality real, those same things demonstrate the existence of God. Now, how they do that, we don't have time to go into. So I just lost all the Christians because most of them are not going to agree with me. I'll just end with this because I've already said 3 things I was going to end with. So I'm going to. The reason why I made the joke, well, here's where I'm going to lose most Christians, because I have reason to believe that most of the Christians watching me are Protestant evangelicals. And natural law theory flourished in America. It's in the Declaration of Independence, with the laws of nature, nature's God expression.
And all through the Constitution, too.
Well, but our birth certificate is natural law, and it's flourished in American thought. That's what got Clarence Thomas in trouble when he was being confirmed by the Senate, was not Anita Hill and all these kind of things. That's what the media picked up on because it was salacious. You read Lawrence Tribe's article in the New York Times. The reason they had a problem with Clarence Thomas was because he was natural law. At least they thought he was. But at any rate, but since most of my hearers that are Christians are probably Protestant evangelicals, for reasons that are only interesting to philosophers, natural law theory eroded in Protestantism sometime after the Protestant Reformation. John Calvin was a natural law theorist, as all the law schools were then. So now, if I bring up natural law theory to some Christians, to some evangelical Protestants, it smells Roman Catholic to them. And they break out in a rash and start going, oh, goodness gracious. And they go, no, it's no more Roman Catholic than the Trinity is Roman Catholic. It's just part of our Christian heritage. Anyway.
So, do you have something you want to say now? I think, thank you for that. That was really thoughtful.
You're welcome. Can I quote you on that?
You can.
I said something thoughtful?
Just on Facebook. So, I said thank you for that. He asked if he could quote me. I said just on Facebook. Sorry, I didn't have the. What is Facebook? We're not really at an impasse. That kind of sucks. That's good. So we just end it? Should we go start a new country?
Well, he probably wouldn't grant what I assert about the metaphysics of nature necessarily, and or whether that is going to play into a cogent argument for. I mean, that's where the breakdown would come from my side, is to be challenged on those.
Right, and
trying to defend your position here.
Same side of that fence, I think.
Okay.
So I think that this conversation is about, the title was Faith and Reason Are the Enemies. Richard started off by talking about how faith and reason actually are friends. I think within the Christian church, oftentimes, at least, I don't know, it seems past a couple decades, maybe the past century, people in the Christian tradition, in Protestant, even in Catholic circles, have abandoned reason for emotion, you might say, experience. I've heard Robert George, a Princeton philosopher, said that when historians are writing this time period, he's saying there was the age of reason, this is the age of feeling. That's a very palpable thing in our age, how I feel, my heart, all these things, which I don't think that there's truth that's necessarily that there isn't truth to be found in our feelings. In fact, there's a woman who wrote a book called Emotion Deeper Than Reason. I think that, like, when we talk about things moving us, what does that mean? If you see, like, I thought it was really funny to think that, like how crazy, like, our marriage laws have become in the West, that pretty much the world stopped to watch the Prince of England and Catherine Middleton get married. Like, why did people stop to watch that? What was it about? Like, they're just like people that we don't really know, but everybody stopped to watch these people get married. We were moved by that. Why are we moved by that? I don't know. It's an interesting question, and I wonder if I'm bringing that up to bring up the idea of mystery. I think that in the annals of human thought, whether it's in science or whether it's in philosophy or history or theology or whatever, I think that story and literature has something to say to philosophy and theology and religion and politics. I think that I was just reading an article this last night, actually 12 o'clock at night. I was reading an article, and this woman wrote an article on mystery. The essay was on mystery, and she was talking about the First World War, and she was just saying that whether or not you admit it, the First World War has affected you, and you don't even know it, because what happened in the World War I and what followed after that, and the influenza, and then the Second World War, and most of your grandparents probably fought in it. I know mine did. My wife's did. He was in the Battle of the Bulge. He went all the way through Europe with Patton's Third Army. Ended up in Berlin. I think that mystery is a part of the conversation on faith and reason and whether or not we can know if God exists. The woman who was writing this article said at the end, and a lot of you may not know this, but Agatha Christie, who knows who she is? Agatha Christie. Okay. Agatha Christie, next to Shakespeare in the Bible, is the leading bestseller in all of history. Agatha Christie. So she tops J.K. Rowling. She tops Tolkien and Lewis. She tops Dante. She tops the Quran. She tops the Book of Mormon, and on it goes. And even Dan Brown, even Donald Trump's The Art of the Deal. She tops that. So I think there's so I wanted to read this. This was a thought I had, and I wanted to have you both kind of expound on this. I think in a very real, deep way that I almost think that language really can't articulate. Like let's just, since we're in a church, it's fitting to bring up Jesus. In the Garden of Gethsemane, even if you're an atheist or a Muslim or a Buddhist or whoever, when you read Christ before his crucifixion, his arrest, his trial, he gets down on his knees and it says that he wept. He wept. I think that moves people, and I think that if we're honest about the world, whether you brought up the Nazis, I thought that might be brought up, or if you brought up Ted Bundy, who butchered 50 women, or if you bring up the fact that there's over 1 million cold cases in the United States that have not been solved, murders that haven't been solved, rape crimes that haven't been solved. If these things go left unjustified, if they're never accounted for, A, does that matter? B, this is Tolkien. I think we have to bring up Tolkien because he was friends with Lewis. In the final battle in The Return of the King, Tolkien expresses a vision, I think, for cosmic renewal that closely mimics the one laid down in the Bible. In Revelation 21, verse 5, we read, "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, I am making all things new.'" The Bible, the God of the Bible, Richard would argue that it is, in fact, the God. Dr. Norman would argue that he doesn't exist. This God says, he declared that one day he will set all things right. And at the end of The Return of the King, Tolkien describes how evil, which, let's be really honest, isn't that the thing that we care about? Evil, right? It's not the thing that grips your heart, right? Beyond all of the things that you think about the nature of the world. Isn't evil, whether it's the thing in your own heart or the thing that we see in the Middle East and people are blowing up people, or if it's in our country where you have people in Charleston killing each other with cars, isn't that the thing that we care about, that we want so badly to be dealt with? So Gandalf says, or Sam says, "Gandalf, I thought you were dead, but then I thought I was dead myself. Is everything sad going to come untrue? What's happened to the world? Gandalf says, a great shadow has departed. And then he laughed, and the sound was like music, or like water in a parched land. And he listened, and the thought came to Sam that he had not heard laughter, the pure sound of merriment, for days upon days without count. So the question is do you think that, Dr. Norman, Dr. Howe, do you think that in all of our musings, whether it's Richard Dawkins, whether it's St. Thomas Aquinas, the Apostle Paul, Socrates, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, an atheist professor at CMU, a Christian professor at Southern Evangelical Seminary, whoever, do you guys think that maybe it's possible that there are things that we don't know? And I'm not capitulating to ignorance. I'm saying, maybe, is it possible in either of your minds, I don't know how you thought of this, I know there's philosophers who have written on mystery extensively. Do you think that, the question is do you think that there's something about the world that we're in that as human beings we can't know? We can't know about how it's going to end, or if it's going to end, or if things are really going to be dealt with. Do you see what I'm asking? Does that make sense?
Well, if I said, gee, I'm not sure whether there's anything I don't know, I would want to see if my students would pick up on how self-referentially incoherent that statement is. Well, the idea of mystery, I think, I mean, if mystery is just the word we give to the fact that probably none of us are omniscient, if that's all we mean, then I would grant, yeah, nobody's omniscient. But I hope that doesn't let someone more or less retire their quest for trying to find out what they can know, all the while bearing in mind that there might be things, I mean, we could never know what Pluto tastes like, probably. That'll be something more. And probably a lot of things that we think we can't know, we probably couldn't care less to know. But your idea of why is there evil in the first place, which came up initially, and then will the evil be dealt with ultimately? I don't see how, whether it will or not is just a factual question. I don't see how an atheist, if he thinks it needs to be and hopes that it will be, could be without some kind of notion of afterlife. I don't, maybe there are some atheists that do believe in afterlife without the notion of God. But I think that that's one of the elements of the Christian faith that's part of the way this answer is sculpted in light of this life is not the only life there is, that we do endure eternally, and that wrongs will be righted and justice will prevail. Now, that, to a large extent, is a question of my faith. I hope that I was persuasive enough in my opening that even if I'm factually wrong about a given thing, that I'm not principally wrong with making the move that I commit myself to some things that I can't be certain about, that I've committed myself nevertheless to it. It's like you ask someone to marry you, you know how you feel about them, how they feel about you, but you realize if they accept your marriage proposal, you're embarking on a life together that you don't know anything, you don't know what it's going to be, so you're trusting this other person, and you're trusting that you can manage these things as they come along, but you don't know it. So I hope that's enough to show that pending our omniscience, we still have to make decisions of how we live. And so one thing that's relevant to this question of mystery, I think, is that it's a logical entailment from the Christian view that God is infinite being. Because if you, especially in classical Christianity, in terms of what it means to know, then there is some meaningful sense in which God is something that is unknowable. But in the classical Aristotelian sense of know, not in the common sense in which we, sort of vernacular sense in which we know. So we reason from effect to cause. We see certain effects in the world. We reason back that we think God is the cause. And I think as a classical Aristotelian Thomistic Christian, that our conversations about God are always draped in the language of the physical world. And we say these are just analogous. This is analogous language. Well, what's going on really? I go, well, I think it's something that I just project as beyond what I'm able to say. And I think there are reasons to believe there is that thing, even though I may be at a loss to be able to capture it by my words, or capture it fully by my words.
Yeah, I guess I would say that our current knowledge is very probably just a drop in the bucket of what's knowable. Moreover, it's not clear that it's a finite bucket. In fact, the people I know who immerse themselves fully in trying to acquire knowledge end up concluding, almost invariably, that for everything we learn, come to know, we basically end up finding out that there are 10 things we don't know. And so nothing, I think, promotes humility like the practice of science. And I think philosophy done right promotes a similar kind of humility in domains about values and other things. I think many people accuse scientists of being arrogant, Richard Dawkins among them. And yet, what I see consistently among people who devote themselves to real inquiry, really finding out as much as they can, they have enormous humility about the areas that they don't yet know, and a great deal of respect for that. In fact, Socrates himself pursued wisdom with a passion and then ended up concluding that he didn't know anything. Now, I guess I wouldn't put it that way myself, but nothing promotes a healthy humility like the disciplined practice of inquiry.
So,
maybe not a final question, but I'll leave this. This is for both of you. What if you're wrong?
You mean about faith and reason, or about God, or what?
You believe that God exists, and Dr. Norman doesn't. What if you're wrong?
Oh,
sorry, sorry about that. I was trying to be cool like Richard.
In sort of a stab at that question is what I think is let me ask a different question first as a segue into it, that I like to see oftentimes in certain debates, if it's a debate about the existence of God or Christianity, whatever, that the question be posed to both debaters, well, what would you count as evidence against your own view? What would, not so much what would convince you, like me asking Andy what would convince you there is a God, or him asking me what would convince me there isn't, but at least something to that direction. What would begin to make you consider maybe this is actually true, or make me consider, maybe this is actually false. And I think that a lot of times Christians don't get asked that question more straightforwardly. If you ask me, this is going to sound cheap, but if you ask me that, the thing that would make me reconsider that I might be right about this, in principle, would be if I was disabused of some of my metaphysics, my Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics, of what I think about causality and essence, existence, substance, properties, accidents, genus, species, proper accidents, specific difference, all these kind of categories, and Aristotle's 10 predicaments and his transcendentals. If I was somehow, whatever it would take to do that, I started reading, somebody gave me a bibliography, says, what do you think about this philosopher? And I started waning in my confidence that those things were true. It would probably mitigate some of my, at least philosophical convictions that this was true. I might still have existential motivations that still make me feel like I matter, and I might cling to it. And by the way, it's interesting why, if it's the case, I'll grant for the sake of argument that people seemingly all want to matter. But I find it interesting, I don't think anyone would ever take the fact that all of us are thirsty to be an argument that there is no such thing as water. But if we're all thirsty, maybe that points to some reality that for whatever reason we have been conditioned to long for. And if it's if it's mattering in the eyes of God or whatever, there may be something to be said about that there is that God. But be that as it may, if it turns out I'm wrong, well, it depends on, in lieu of me being right, who ends up being right. If you say, what if you're wrong and Andy's right? Well, then when I'm dead, that's just the end of it. Presumably, you don't believe in an afterlife. Now, if I'm wrong and the Muslims are right, then I'm toast. Or for that matter, if the Mormons are right, I'm toast. And you could just go down the list. Well, what if the Hindus are right? Well, if it's a Panashatic Hinduism, I might get another shot at it, And I could go down and tell you, well, what if you're wrong and this guy's right? Then I'd tell you, well, then... And then some of them, even if I'm wrong and this guy's right, I'm still going to skate. So it kind of depends on who else is right in light of me being wrong before I could give too much of an answer.
So if I'm wrong, I may well be going to hell. But honestly, I don't lose a moment's sleep over it. I would attach a probability to heaven and hell's being true. I attach such a low probability to that I have not lost a moment's sleep over the issue, and I don't know a singular secular humanist who has.
I want to open up for Q&A. So this is a time where Adam is going to... Okay. Do you want to...
Pass out. So what I'll do is I'll walk around with the mic. If you want to talk for 15 minutes, it's $100. I know how it is. It's everywhere. It's just how it goes. And it's $100 to me. If it's a check, it's Korman is my last name. So we'll just do that. And then just say if it's for Andy or Richard or both, and then ask your question. So let me see your hands if you have a question. All right, we're going to go in sequence. I'm going to go back there and come this way. You're the furthest back? All right.
Hi, my name's Liz. One of the reasons that I wanted to talk is because I haven't heard a woman's voice, and other than J.K. Rowling and Agatha Christie, a woman's name all night. And something is really wrong when there's a huge portion of the population that is not involved in this. Now, I know, I grew up in the Christian tradition, but I've never been a Christian. I never could find a way to believe in any of it. And I gave up as a child, actually. I just gave up on religion and accepted the fact that I was an atheist, and later found out that I was a secular humanist, which was wonderful. And I'm very happy in that belief. There are a lot of women in the secular humanist tradition. There are women in religious traditions too, although to my way of thinking, a lot of religion is about men making rules about how women live their lives. Secular humanism also started out in the United States very male-dominated. But we know some Emma Goldman, we know Margaret Sanger, some really impactful women who were part of the secular humanist movement. I would like to hear from both of our speakers tonight whether they think that women have an important role in this philosophy and how they would magnify our voices.
I think, just to break the silence here, there's something very important about the nature of your question that needs to be emphasized, and that is, and correct me if I've misunderstood, that your question implies that there are real differences between men and women. Because if there wasn't significant or interesting differences between men or women, we probably wouldn't even notice that a woman's voice was missing. I just was talking to a friend of mine who works for Microsoft. I think this was the friend, but he was talking about Microsoft. Microsoft's watch, their phone watch or something that they had come out with, was an abysmal failure in the marketplace. And somebody pointed out to them, probably one of the reasons why it failed is the development team of this device didn't have a woman on it. Now, the person telling me this was telling me this as if this was, well, how stupid is that, what difference does that make? And I'm thinking, and I said this, I said, that makes sense to me. I asked my wife this. I said, does this make sense to you? Because the very fact that they didn't get a woman's perspective, the reason that mattered is because the woman had something to bring to the observation that a man wouldn't be able to say. I think that's true. And so now I can't, it's not my fault that tonight you're the first woman that said anything, or I mean, I can't help it that I'm not a woman and that they didn't ask a woman. I mean, in other words, I don't know there was any kind of collusion. Hey, let's see if we can exclude as many women as possible. I don't think that's the case. It might be a sort of an unconscious collusion, some people may think. But be that as it may, I like the question because I think it implies something that is being minimized in our culture in some context, that there isn't really a difference between a man and a woman, and it's something you can just choose to be whenever you want to choose to be that. And I go, I think it's a lot more robust and complex than just merely that. So I celebrate your desire to want to see a woman's voice and a woman's perspective brought to these cosmic questions.
Can I just add, too, that my dearest friend in the world is a woman, and she just so happens to be my wife. The second thing, one of my favorite thinkers is, she stole it. That woman stole it.
May I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Here. Well, yeah, I want to waive my answer so that we can hear from another woman in the Q&A.
Okay, that was.
I applaud you both for interacting, and I think that this is a really, this was the way that I, came out of Christianity. I didn't mean to come out of Christianity. I wanted to test my beliefs against the best argument, and that did lead me out of Christianity, and now I'm an atheist. But I was going to ask Andy, what is the best Christian apologist in your opinion, and ask, I forget your name. I know, Andy. I was going to ask you what you thought the best atheist writer is.
Okay. So I teach in my philosophy classes sections on reason and faith, and I teach several essays which are just brilliant defenses of faith. One is by William James called The Will to Believe. Another contemporary philosopher who defends Christian views and who I admire greatly is Alvin Plantinga, who's also took me rock climbing one time. And that, while I was busy clinging to a top rope, he clambered up an even more difficult climb with no top rope at all. That is a man of deep faith, I can tell you, and a lovely, lovely human being.
Well, I teach a course, at least I've taught it several times, I hope I get to teach again, titled Contemporary Atheism. So all of the assigned textbooks are atheist philosophers. And I have never found a better, I categorize them at least in two different ways. Popular, that is non-technical, written for a general audience type of book, and then a technical, inside baseball, philosophical. I've never found a better atheist popular level than George Smith in his book, Atheism, The Case Against God. And I think he's very thoughtful. I don't agree with his conclusions, obviously, but I think he's very thoughtful. He tries, I think he does a great job of trying to interact with the arguments in as much as he gets the arguments. So George Smith I really like. In terms of more technical atheism, and the thing, you mentioned Richard Dawkins. A friend of mine, Christian, saw a friend of hers, young Christian, reading Dawkins because he was interested in exploring atheism. She said, there are a lot better atheists to read than Richard Dawkins. I don't necessarily accuse him of being arrogant or whatever, but what has riled academic Christians about Dawkins, just so you'll know, is not any kind of arrogance as such. It's this confidence that he has in light of an abject ignorance of his subject. As long as he talks about science, he's a consummate scientist. He knows virtually nothing about philosophy of religion. He knows nothing about Thomas Aquinas, even though he has a section of a chapter on Aquinas' argument. He obviously didn't read Aquinas. So there are a lot better atheists to read. George Smith, I think, is the best popular. As far as more academic, written for academic, I think Michael Martin is one of the best. His book, Atheism, A Philosophical Justification. And then he's gone on to co-edit a book called The Improbability of God and then The Impossibility of God. And then also, I think, Kai Nielsen, whom I had the pleasure of meeting and have him come to debate the existence of God when I was a graduate student. I got to help organize that back in when I was in graduate school. So Kai Nielsen and Michael Martin stand at the top, in my mind, as really thoughtful and probably the best, in my mind, is J.L. Mackie. And I think if you're a Christian and you want to study atheism, you have to read Mackie's The Miracle of Theism. He was a professor of philosophy at Oxford University, and is probably one of the most important atheists of the 20th century, at least in my opinion.
Hello, my name is Jim. My question is thank you. My question is for Dr. Norman. Within your ethical system, as a secular humanist, is there ever a situation where death is justified or justifiable? And take that in whatever context you think appropriate, whether capital punishment, war, or whatever. Is death justifiable under any circumstance or no?
I can imagine many situations where I would be willing, some situations where I think it would be justifiable to sacrifice one's own life for the greater good. As a humanist, I try not to say things that give people permission to kill. But I'm also aware that situations can be very complicated, and that we, for example, sometimes need to defend ourselves. So I'm almost a complete believer in nonviolence, in almost religious about my belief in nonviolence, but I can't ultimately justify a completely absolutist standpoint with regard to that.
My name's Victor, and I have a question for Dr. Howe. You dropped a balloon when you were talking about the Ken Ham and Bill Nye debates. You said that there were debates that you thought were far more important that weren't covered or considered in churches. And I was wondering what those debates were. Were they debates on particular topics? And if so, what were the topics? Or were they debates between two sets of people, like Christopher Hitchens and whoever he was debating? So what were these debates that you thought were missed?
Okay, I want to make sure I'm following you, because it sounded like the question was sort of like, do you drive to work or do you carry your lunch? That is, I don't see the debate that Hitchens had, the ones I'm familiar with, to be any exception to the concept of debating a certain topic. So to answer your question directly, they would be more often debates about whether God exists. There's been a lot of those. William Lane Craig has done a lot, and there are countless these on YouTube. He debated Peter Atkins, for example, back in the late 90s at the Jimmy Carter Center in Atlanta, Georgia, that I had the privilege of being at live. And it's probably on YouTube. And Peter Atkins has written probably the single most widely used book of chemistry in Anglo-American universities. And so they debated, Christianity, which way does the evidence point? I forget exactly how they titled it. So generally, there are questions about the existence of God. I just watched a debate very recently, which I found fascinating. I want to watch again. Dinesh D'Souza, and I think his opponent his last name was Bernstein. He was a gentleman I was not familiar with, so forgive me, his name doesn't stick in my head. They debated, has Christianity been good or bad for the world? And it was a fascinating tour de force of the history of Western civilization, from the ancient Greeks to the Enlightenment and beyond. So I found that to be a substantive debate. And so I didn't mean to impugn every church in the world. I'm just talking about churches that were in my radar screen that I thought, why wouldn't that excite you? Why wouldn't that debate that's substantive between an academic historian and social critics on existence of God? You got these scientists, you got these philosophers. I don't know the answer, by the way, as to why. I mean, I have my suspicions. But I just regret that. I don't mean, again, to impugn Bill Nye or Ken Ham, except to say that I think that was just a waste of that's a part of your life you're not going to be able to get back. And I regret. The only thing that I think that came out of that was good that I saw was that at least got people talking about some of these issues. And so that's sort of like, at least when hurricane hit Florida, people started talking about, and I go, yeah, well, that's a high price to pay, maybe. I don't want a hurricane to have to happen every time so we can start talking about it. I don't want Ken Ham to have to debate Bill Nye I hate that's the price we have to pay. I just wish that Christians, and I try to do my best, and this is what Ratio Christi is about, by the way, to try to get Christians to go, no, these are the platforms on which these arguments need to proceed. Arguments with thoughtful and informed and intelligent atheists or unbelievers in terms of what's the argument, what's the evidence, and how do we come to these decisions? And let's just get it out in as cordial as a way, and then when we're done, if we don't agree, we agree not to kill each other. We go out afterwards for a beer or for a Diet Coke or whatever. That's what I know Andy's heart is, as much as I can tell from seeing him on YouTube and tonight, and that's what my heart is. But existence of God were most of them.
I was going to say, I love fielding questions, but I know that I have a much more comfortable chair up here than many of you do. I want to make sure everybody's doing okay. Are we taxing your patience at this point? Maybe. I certainly won't be offended if anybody needs to stretch their legs or I'll move on. But
I was going to leave.
Okay. All right. If you're all okay with it.
Yes. This question is for Dr. Andy. One of my favorite arguments for the existence of God comes from Thomas Aquinas. It's titled De Ente et Essentia. It means on being and essence. And my question for you is, are you familiar with that argument? And if you are, what don't you like about it?
I'm afraid I'm not familiar with it under that designation. So perhaps not. I am familiar with the 5 versions of the cosmological argument that Dr. Howe referred to earlier, but I'm afraid my knowledge of Aquinas does not run very deep.
Can I try to answer something about that? You didn't ask me, but the De Ente et Essentia is actually the title of a philosophical treatise that Aquinas wrote. It's the only thing that he wrote that was exclusively philosophical. Pretty much everything else he wrote was theological, that used philosophy, or it was commentary on Scripture or commentary on another philosopher. So it translates on being in essence. And so there's an argument that comes out of that. What I find interesting about the fact that you asked this is that very few people that even traffic in apologetics, existence of God, cosmological argument are familiar with that argument. And it's actually the argument that I give when I debate the existence of God. And there's a fantastic, in my opinion, book on this titled Aquinas' Way to God, the argument from De Ente et Essentia on being in essence by Gavin Kerr, Kerr. And if you're interested in that as far as, I'd like to hear a fairly robust philosophical argument. And it's not the 5 ways, even though my dissertation was on the second of Thomas's 5 ways. It's not at all like that argument. Or I shouldn't say at all, but it's not the same argument. I think it's a good argument. So I commend Gavin Kerr's article to
Send me a link
to you. Absolutely, I will.
So I wanted to ask a question, and I'm hoping for very concrete answers if possible. Both sides have indicated an openness to the possibility of being mistaken, the possibility of changing their minds if presented with sufficient argument, sufficient evidence. We're in the Church of the Ascension. I believe there's a depiction behind the speakers. I wanted to use that as a concrete example and ask what arguments or what evidence would convince you to reverse your position about that specific event. And either speaker who would like to field that question.
Okay, fine. Are you speaking specifically of the resurrection?
thinking of the ascension. So this would be, I suppose, after the resurrection, but before the second coming.
Yeah.
There he is rising.
So what would disabuse me of my belief in the ascension? Is that what I want to make sure I'm...
What would change your mind?
About the ascension specifically. Gee, I don't know. I'd have to think about that. Because in my mind, as you were formulating your question, I thought you were making reference specifically to the resurrection, which is a necessary condition, presumably, for the ascension, at least as the ascension is in the New Testament. And there, I know what I would say. If I got convinced they found the bones of Jesus, the old joke is told where they said, you tell this like it really happened. So, they think they found the bones of Jesus. And you go, what? He said, yeah, they found a skeleton, and it had a bracelet on it that says, what would I do? That's pretty bad. Well, if they found the bones of Jesus, then he wasn't really raised from the dead, and then therefore he wasn't ascended. But if you just mean, well, we'll grant the resurrection, but somehow let's call into question the ascension. I suppose if someone gave me a cogent argument that the word ascension there didn't mean what we thought it meant in Koine Greek, we found some papyrus evidence that actually the word meant that Jesus ran around the block after he rose from the dead and went out of their sight. Okay, I might go, okay, well, I always thought it was like he went up, but maybe it meant he just ran down the road and ran around the building after he rose from the dead. I don't mean to be silly, I'm just saying I'd have to imagine what would make me specifically call the question in the ascension in light of the fact that there was a resurrection.
So I'm not very clear on the difference between the resurrection and the ascension myself, but I'm going to treat them together. Imagine what it would take to persuade you that, I don't know, that people on the other side of the planet could levitate. You'd want to see it for yourself, right? Or maybe you'd want to see a video of it. So if a video turned up of Jesus ascending, that might persuade me. But if you think about the fact that the stories about his ascension are essentially anecdotal and handed down and handed down and handed down and written down and recopied and edited and so on, it's almost impossible for me to imagine that people can conclude that the evidence, the historical evidence or the evidence of the Bible is reliable. It seems to me horrendously unreliable, as most of the historical evidence from that time was.
There's a video of Chris Angel, the magician. You guys know who Chris Angel is, the magician? There's an actual video on YouTube of him ascending. He floats from the top of one high-rise building across the street and lands on another. And you can go on YouTube and see that. And I would suspect nobody believes that he actually did do that. So even a video probably wouldn't be enough.
Isn't even enough.
Yeah, it wouldn't. Because you would go, yeah, I think that was probably a trick.
Necessary, but not sufficient.
Yeah.
Hi, I have a question for Andy. Just going back to your idea of that we can know what's good. You said based on what promotes human flourishing. I was kind of curious, do you see that more societally or individually? And when those come in conflict, how is that resolved?
Wow, wonderful, two wonderful questions. Any morality that only took personal flourishing into account would not be morality worthy of the name, in my view. So it has to do with all of us flourishing, I think, at a minimum. Now, there are some very difficult and complex questions that arise about the trade-offs between personal flourishing and the flourishing of others, or the flourishing of everyone generally. And those fall into under the heading of justice. What do we mean by fairness and justice? It's a hugely complex and difficult topic, but there's some wonderful work done on it by philosophers. But I don't think we're anywhere close to having an easy answer to your question. It's a lovely question, and I hope you and all of us will continue to reflect on that question throughout our lives, because humanity as a whole needs to make more progress on that question. And unfortunately, I don't have either the wisdom or the time to speak the full truth on that, not even close.
Yeah, I agree that it is complex. This is what, among other things, Plato's Republic. And Plato uses the analogy of the parts of a human being, soul, body, mind, in terms of their interaction to the flourishing of the whole human being. And he thinks there's a sort of analogy between individual parts of the individual parts of a single human to the flourishing of that whole human, and then individual parts of the society to the flourishing of the whole of society. So at least that's a good place to start. Maybe you're already a Plato scholar for all I know, but that's a good place to start as far as how Western civilization has wrestled with this question of the intersection of societal goods versus individual goods. I suspect, though, many Americans will kind of cringe at Plato's answer to this. And certainly the Greeks seem to not have a problem with slavery as a natural part of human experience, which I think hopefully Americans have learned the hard way that that's not right. But at least the principles, the philosophical principles, what's come up. And then Aristotle has his own sort of modification of that in his Nicomachean Ethics, primarily. Although he doesn't seem to get as much into the individual society question as the Republic does, unless my memory's failing me in that regard. I just wanted to show you that I knew something about Plato, that's all. That's why I just threw that in.
This question's for Dr. Norman. This would be a twofold question. Well, first of all, I wanted to say thank you both of you for the debate. I'm a pastor, I'm a believer, and I do agree with you on religion. In other words, I think religion is really bad for society, it's bad for Christianity, and I think a lot of churches with religion push people into atheism. But now the question that I have for you is, okay, I'm walking down a hall in a hospital, and this is a true story, and you are walking beside me, and I'll just say this is in the situation, you're with me. Walking down the hall, I turn into a room. There's a young lady laying in a bed. She's dying of cancer. She has a tumor on her stomach as big as a cinnamon roll. I walk up to her, speak with her, ask her about her faith, and I ask her if she believes in Jesus and speak with her a little bit. She accepts Jesus as her Savior. And I said, would you like me to lay hands on you and ask Jesus to heal you? And she says, yes. So I lay my hand on her forehead, and I can feel just a warmth coming through my hand. And she takes my other hand and put it on her stomach. And I feel the tumor just in a matter of like 25, 30 seconds, I don't know how long it was, it's gone, completely gone. So the doctors, she only has so much time to live. All the documentation, everything's done. You're standing there with me. Okay, what do you think in that situation? Second part of the question is, and this is, God forbid, I don't ever want this to happen. A month later, you're in that same situation. You're lying in that bed. I'm walking in that hospital. I pass by the room. Dr. Norman, how are you? Oh, good, Pastor John, I'm doing great. Do you want me to come in? Would you like me to pray with you? If you could answer that, please.
Wow, that's a powerful story. I guess in answer to your first question, if I observed that, or if I was led by sufficient evidence to think that actually happened, I'd immediately conclude that the world is far stranger than I had imagined, and that there's a good deal of revision to my worldview that is required. So experiences like that, I would welcome them because my eyes have not been opened to such things so far. Now, if I myself needed to be prayed for, I guess there's a couple different, if I had witnessed you heal someone else, I suppose I'd be even especially inclined to accept your offer of prayer. If not, I'm fundamentally an experimentalist at heart. If you want to try stuff, and I like to try stuff and see what works. I haven't had any experience of prayer working for me. So I encourage people to try. Both to try prayer, to try non-belief, to try humanism, and see what works.
That was great, and it's really hard to follow that. But I want to just come back to a simpler question. We've mentioned C.S. Lewis a number of times. In the Screw Tape Letters, one of the things he said is that the devil can use either extreme. So what I'd like you to talk, each of you to talk about, is what happens when your argument or your position gets taken to its extreme. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I'm not quite sure what an argument, my argument, let's say, for God's existence being taken. I mean, if you take it to the extreme, you'd believe that God exists. That's the extreme of it, because that's what the argument.
Could it be misused to go further than that?
Oh, yeah.
Like, and what happens when you use...
That would happen even without the argument. There are people that believe in God and fly planes into buildings because God told them to do that in their mind. So that seems to be manifestly the case. But I don't think that's an indictment on, or I should say, that's irrelevant to the question of whether it's true that God exists. Even if we came to believe that God, if there really was a God, and I came to believe that there was a God, and by coming to believe that I did something terrible, it doesn't negate the fact that there is a God. It's a matter of what is true. Or at least what can we conclude is true based on the best arguments we can entertain. And so I don't think it's when questions turn to things like the D'Souza debate that I mentioned, is a certain ideology like Christianity or secularism or whatever, are these things deleterious to society or not? I think that's a fair question to ask anybody. But what I want to make sure people realize is that that's a fair question with respect to the question, is this or is it not deleterious to society? But that's not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily answer the question, is this or is this not true? Even something could be deleterious, I suppose, hypothetically, that still might be true. I mean, I guess it seems like it could be, at least in principle. So I separate the questions, and I like both of the questions. They're just different questions.
I think it's always possible to take a good thing too far. And so the question or the invitation to reflect whether I have taken a certain position or a certain logic or a certain idea too far is always welcome, because I welcome that check on my own. I mean, I get enthusiastic about certain things and can push them pretty hard sometimes. And when a friend like Ned pushes back and encourages me to think about whether I've taken it too far, I often learn a great deal.
Hi, I just have a comment on what the other person said regarding the lady with cancer. So if I have to pray to God in order to get healed from cancer, what does that imply? God does not help those people with cancer who don't pray? That sounds like a very evil and cruel God to me. I mean, that would not enforce my belief in God. If anything, it would negate it. I mean, why does one need to pray to be healed from cancer? If he created all of us, shouldn't he love all of us equally?
I'll let that go between you two at a beer afterwards. Not that it's not a good question, but we want to keep it between these two. One more question? Two more questions? Three more questions, and then we'll close out.
Three more questions, two more answers.
Can anyone hear this? Yep. Cool. Thank you, Dr. Howe. Thank you, Dr. Norman, for your discussion tonight. So I had just a basic question about the Thomism that you were sort of supporting tonight. Two questions. Do you believe that God is temporal? Do you think he is within the realm of time? And if so, does that sort of limit the powers that he might have or the sort of essence he might have? Secondly, do you think God is simple? Do you think that means that God's goodness or God's power can all be combined into one quality? And if you do, if the answer is yes to both questions, how do you relate God to the world of real experience, if that is possible? How do you make God an intelligible concept? And do you care if people can think about God in a way other than by inference or reason? Do you care if people is it a good enough argument to say that I've experienced God, therefore I believe? Or do you think the only way is by logic and reason and inference? Thank you.
Well, no, I do not believe God is temporal. Yes, I do believe God is simple. The way I would try to render that coherent with respect to other questions like how does God relate to the world, the best I can do here would be to commend someone to some particular reading on the subject where it can be unpacked. I will say that in my experience in terms of critics of the doctrine of simplicity, this is just my experience, they don't understand the doctrine of simplicity. It's evident from their objections, well, that's not what the doctrine is saying. So James Dolezal's book, God Without Parts, is a good place to start, I think, for Edward Fazer. His blog, he's got a number of just very, very helpful and succinct blog entries on the question of simplicity. He's got two that come to mind specifically, so you should be able to search his, it's F-E-S-E-R, looks like Fesser, but it's pronounced Phaser like in Star Trek.
He wrote The Last Superstition.
Yeah, he wrote The Last Superstition. His most recent book is 5 Proofs for God's Existence, or 5 Proofs for God, which are not the 5 ways, interestingly, because that's what I thought they were. And so that, I think, would be good. And I thought there was a third one that hooked in, but I didn't catch it, right? Yeah, well, at any rate, does that... Okay.
This is for Dr. Howe. My question is, I've been believing some things differently a little bit recently about my original faith and beliefs I had in the Scripture. And my question is, to remain a true believer, do you have to take the entire Bible literally? Or such as we mentioned C.S. Lewis, he believed things like Jonah was allegorical, hell's locked from the inside. He didn't believe the Psalms were absolutely all letters from David. He just believed it was poets. We didn't know exactly who they were. Would that be heretical, or could you believe things such as he did and still be a true believer?
I think that you absolutely could believe things like he did and be a true believer. First of all, I don't know anybody, or very many people, that would take the Bible literally when Psalm 94:1 says that God's going to bring us under his wings and cover us with his feathers. I don't know any Jew that's ever believed that God was a bird. When Isaiah 55 talks about the trees shall clap their hands, I don't know anybody that believes that trees literally have hands. So obviously the Bible uses figures of speech, metaphor, simile, hyperbole, synecdoches, metonymies, all kinds of things. That's sort of the staple, because that's the way humans talk. But I take your question to be a little bit more serious than just this, in that what about substantive things like Jonah and the whale or the first chapters of Genesis? There, what I think is at stake is not so much heresy versus orthodoxy, but a consistent principle of hermeneutics. That is to say, if someone thinks that this particular story is an allegory, it ought to arise out of a normal, conscientious application of sound principles of hermeneutics. What hermeneutics would be the principles of interpretation of speech or writing, that you apply these consistently. And so, at worst, I think, pending that the guy isn't a heretic, the worst thing I think that a person gives up when they start doing things like C.S. Lewis did is they might give up a certain view of the nature of inspiration of the Bible and a certain view about its inerrancy. And Christians debate these things, and Christians disagree. So I don't think it's a matter of eternal life or not. Okay. Personally, I don't think so.
Thanks.
But it's not to say I don't think they're important. I do think they're critically important, but I don't think they're life and death.
All right, this is our last question, and then if you guys have some final things you want to say, please feel free to do so.
Okay, you're going to get a bookend of women, and I'm going to give you a different view. It isn't a matter of a different voice, it's sort of a matter of power or access, because I was born thinking I was equal, and I went through catechism and quit at 5 years old because I saw the men went first, women couldn't be priests, et cetera, et cetera. And we have a vice president that says he can't be in a room alone with a woman except his wife. So how could I ever have a job with that vice president? But that wasn't my question. My question is really, I came in here and one of the bumper stickers or something said, you know, what if I'm right or what if I'm wrong? But I have a question. Why isn't it sufficient for you to believe? Why do you have to have an agenda to persuade others? Why not confidentially keep your own counsel? That's my question.
I take that's to me, but
either one.
Because what is
why do we have to change someone else's opinion to
would
be
be analogous,
happy with our own?
Sorry. It would be analogous to, whether I'm right or wrong in thinking this, it would be analogous to thinking you had the cure for cancer. If you thought that you had the cure for cancer, how motivated would you be to try to go to everybody you thought had cancer and give them the cure? Now, we could debate as to whether you do or don't have the cure for cancer, or whether there is or isn't a such thing as cancer. That's fine. But given that if you think there's a such thing as cancer, and you think you have the cure, and you think there are people that have cancer, how motivated would you be to go out and want to persuade them to take this cure? And they're going, well, you know, people that take that cure think they're better than everything. That's fine, but that's the motivation behind it. I think Christianity is true. I think that believing and trusting in Jesus makes a person eternally flourishing and happy. I could be wrong about that, but that's what I think is the case. So that's what motivates me to want to see other people become Christians. That, in fact, is the Christians that I know, that's their motivation. They want everybody around them to become a Christian. And they want that because they think it's true, or at least the ones I know think that. And they care and they love their fellow man. And so that doesn't make it true because they think that, but I think it points to, but this is what's going on. Now, I'm not suggesting there aren't other Christians that their motivation is get people in their church to pay tithes so that they can buy a $5 million house. That may be true too, but that's fine. That's just I'd say, yeah, I would repudiate that as well. That's not my motive. You don't get rich being an apologist and an itinerant lecturer in philosophy. So my motive is because I think it's true, and I think people would benefit eternally if they think it's true.
So I had to think long and hard about this very question before deciding to come out of the humanist closet. In other words, many people, many well-meaning people can say, well, okay, fine, non-belief is okay for you, but why do you have to go out there and disturb other people's beliefs? I mean, I think that's a well-intended question, and I think it deserves consideration. And I think my answer is this. Our beliefs matter, and they matter for the well-being of others. There's a widespread ideology afoot now that basically says everybody should be allowed to believe whatever they damn please, and nobody has a right to interfere with anybody else's beliefs. The problem with that is that it's false, because some beliefs cause people to, for example, kill one another. And there are many, many harmful beliefs out there, and which is why we need education. We need people to encourage people to think about these things. It always gives me pause. I always think twice before I say something that I think might disturb a cherished belief. But if I didn't think that it was serving the greater good to raise questions about those cherished beliefs, I wouldn't do it. Thank you all for your time and attention. You've been very, very patient and attentive, and I'm grateful for that.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you all very, very much.